of the Warp by Graham McNeill. Ashir Mock had known pain before, had even embraced it on occasion. But the pain caused by the Phoenix Lord's blade was a new species of agony entirely. Sharper than any natural edge could possibly be, the Eldar weapon's ancient power was anathema to those whose flesh seethed with the warp. His right arm ended just below his ebon-black shoulder guard, the jagged bronze trim now spattered red with impossibly vivid blood. Ashir Mock hauled himself across the wetted floor towards the Lazarus Requiem, knowing he had but moments to complete its unlocking, or his very soul was forfeit. Centuries had passed since anyone had spilled his blood. Even the Silver Skull's warlock, whose agonizing death had drawn Ashir Mock's gaze to this auspicious system, had not laid a blade upon him. The Phoenix Lord's purity of hate was primally potent, something Ashir Mock could almost admire. Even as the opening of the Lazarus Requiem had consumed the entirety of his focus, he'd felt the arrival of her manifold soul and gasped in wonder at such razor-like purpose, such all-consuming fury. Flanked by a howling coven of her bone-armoured handmaidens, she slid from the portal of amber light, a Triskel blade of black fire cocked at one shoulder, a whip-bladed polearm held out like a lance. Jane Zar she was called, a deathly warrior queen from a long-extinct epoch of her doomed race. Ceramic-smooth armour encased her lithe form, and violet hair billowed around an elegantly tapered war mask, beautiful beneath a magnesium sky. But the radiance overhead was no sky. And this was no terrazzo-floored temple. The molten heart of the world's core burned all around a peeled sliver of the planet's surface, floating inviolate within a warp sphere of Ashir Mock's creation. Ashir Mock had come to destroy Velios, opening the Lazarus Requiem within its heart and offering every soul upon it to the Dark Prince. The polished lacquer sides of the box were gloss black and utterly smooth, with the seams of its myriad parts all but invisible. With each segment of its fiendish complexity he unlocked, he drew closer to revealing the legendary hand of the withered Eldar goddess. And with it in his possession, he would master fate. The box hung in the center of the peeled shard of the planet's surface, its impossible angles and multi-dimensional intricacy confounding even his gene-hand senses with its violation of perspective and psychic geometry. And just as he had come to destroy Velios, the Phoenix Lord had come to save it. Her flashing Triskel blade, its edges wreathed in black fire, sheathed his arm from his body in a shrieking blaze of unlight, leaving him sprawled in agony. His warriors and the demons of the warp birthed from the Lazarus Requiem's opening rose to his defense. Warriors of bone white and ebon darkness clashed in a swirling melee of blindingly swift blades, psychosonic screeches, and lustful howls. Just as beautiful as the Eldar in their own way, the Slaneshi demons fought with claws instead of blades, teeth instead of pistols, seeking to inflict wondrous agonies as much as kill. The Dark Prince had claim on Velios, but ever the Eldar sought to thwart the designs of their ancient nemesis. That could not be allowed to happen. Power had been promised, pact struck and bargain sealed in the currency of souls. Velios had to die. The consequences of failure were too fearful to contemplate. Even death in this moment would not save him from the Dark Prince's spite. The final confrontation of the Lazarus Requiem spun in frenzied agitation, aching to be unlocked, demanding he finished what he started and opened the gateway to the Empyrean. Ashir Mock pushed himself to his knees, his one remaining hand extended before him as he turned the last psychic key in the gateway's last quivering alignment. It remained closed, and Ashimok felt his soul-deep dread swallow his soul as he heard the Dark Prince's wail of frustration and fury. How had he failed? Everything had been done as Moriana's scrolls had instructed. He had spoken the words that were not words, poured the rancid blood upon the pictograms of ruin, and solved the alchemical wards woven into the Requiem structure. How had he failed? Ashimok lifted his racked gaze and looked into the heart of the nightmarish lattice at the heart of the Lazarus Requiem, seeing a host of unblinking eyes at the center of a beguiling vortex of unimaginable power. In their depths, he saw endless labyrinths of glassy geometries, crystalline pyramids of enormous scale, and a web of glittering strands of fate that bound all living things. And then he knew why he had failed. The changer of the ways, the unknowable sentience that lay at the heart of every conspiracy, had gifted much of Ashimok's arcane knowledge and made him more powerful than all, save Zaraphiston himself. But the architect of fate was a jealous patron, and such a being did not suffer those who served him seeking power from a rival for men's souls. "No!" hissed Ashimok. "I am your faithful servant!" Tearing agony ripped through Ashimok as a slender, bone-pale spear haft burst from his chest. He looked at the blade in wonder, its structure harmoniously curved. It would be no disgrace to be slain by such a weapon. He felt Jane Zar's presence at his shoulder, a weight of ages and suffering, laced with the charnel horror of millennia for the souls she had consumed to sustain her existence. "You are a fool, sorcerer," she hissed. "Arcona will burn the galaxy." And then the Lazarus Requiem opened. The Immaterium bloated into the heart of Velios. The Dark Prince's demons chorused their ecstasy as the warriors who served Ashimok became phantoms of ash, burned from existence by an onrushing tsunami of warp fire. The Eldar fared no better. Not even their preternatural speed could save them, and even as Ashimok was borne up by fate's consuming fire, he laughed at their screams. They fled for the web gate that had brought them to the world's heart, for the Dark Prince would not be so easily cheated of his soul dues. Spirit stones flared to cinders in the blaze, and Slanesh laughed as their wretched souls were loosed. Their screams were unending, as would be the torments at the hands of the very power they had birthed. Jane Zar was the last of the aliens to die, her body shrieking as her armor came apart in a clatter of glowing fragments. Swirling, multicolored light billowed from within as the host of souls within were silenced. Her weapons and armor flew into the Eldar webgate as shockwaves from the portal to the Immaterium tore ever wider. The molten core of the planet churned at the cancer in its heart, shuddering in primordial agony and splitting the world above asunder. Even as the warp swallowed him, Ashimok laughed as he felt Velios die, its bones shattering into void-born fragments of dead rock. The Dark Prince would devour every screaming soul upon this world, including his. A sense of time stretching, snapping, reassembling, but out of joint, events flowing in an acausal fashion, reaction no longer following action, a fractured narrative of existence. Ashimok had no perception of when the world changed, just an awareness that it had. His body must surely be dead, for Velios was gone and this was the Immaterium. The warp was no place for flesh and bone, only spirit and soul. And yet, he felt pain, indefiable until he followed it to its sources. A burning canyon tore through his chest and a void where his arm ought to be. Blood coiled in slow, slippery arcs from the wounds. Each gem-like droplet rippled with life, unnaturally fecund in this place of dark miracles, where every breath was laden with potential. How long had passed since the doom of Velios? Mok had no sense of time's passage, but what else could he have experienced in a realm where such concepts were as meaningless as mortal conceits of right and wrong? To traverse the warp was to be cast adrift on time's ocean, a leaf in a hurricane, where a moment could stretch to infinity or 1,000 lifetimes pass in the blink of an eye. Yet there was a purpose to his movements, an implacable will guiding him as fair winds might carry lost souls on the seas. He was being borne away from Velios, and the distant howl of a thwarted god promised a debt that would not be forgotten. Where this apparently fair wind might guide him he neither knew nor cared. That it was away from Velios was what mattered. Mok kept his mortal eyes shut tight. Only screaming lunacy awaited those who stared too long into the warp, and he had madnesses enough. The voices that muttered in the darkness of his shadow were enough to convince him of that. Sometimes he allowed himself to think they were the souls of those his sorcery had consigned to the warp. At other times they seemed more akin to the Tulitaries who once conjured by the dead sorcerers of Prospero. They babbled and gossiped, they argued and advised, whispering secrets wrapped in nonsense, wisdom masked by insanity. They yammered and gabbled at him now, whispering in a torrent of interleaved voices, some accusing, some hateful, some pleading and others laughing maniacally. He could make no sense of it until one voice cut through them all. One voice that spoke his name. Mok knew that voice. It had condemned worlds to die, had cursed the names of gods and led all the legions of the lost and the damned to glory and blood. Silver lines, parallel and bright as mercury, cut the darkness behind his eyes, the meat of the immaterium sliced open by a talon that once belonged to an all-too-mortal god. These blades had taken the life of a demigod brother and all but ended the false emperor of man. Redolent with such potent blood, they effortlessly reached through immeasurable distances of space and time. The warp was quick to seize on this breach in the veil between worlds, but it churned in fury as it found itself denied passage. A will of unbending power stood in the breach, bound to a titan in the blackest armor, and bearing the favor of all the powers that claimed dominion of the immaterium. The god in black spoke again, and his words were terrifyingly clear. "I am not done with you, sorcerer," said Abaddon. The Despoiler, they called him, the Arch-Heretic, the Damned One. In ages past, men had once known him as Ezekiel, but such men were all dead and consigned to the forgotten ages, many by the Despoiler's own hand. Mok's flesh felt cold and hard, inflexible and horribly solid. After so long a time, or was it the briefest instant, adrift in the warp, where change was the norm and constancy anathema, his body felt entirely too heavy and too real. Here he was flesh and bone, wrought by long-forgotten science to be an apex killer, an angel of death. But in the warp he could be so much more. "Sorcerer!" snapped a voice like a dagger's cold blade. Mok opened his eyes, wincing as harsh reality pressed in around him with its unbending angles and rigid hierarchy of form. He recognized his surroundings immediately. The stratagem of the vengeful spirit, the Despoiler's flagship. His senses were assailed by physical stimuli, hot oils, decaying flesh, blood, and, most potent of all, fear. Fear saturated every breath taken here. Fear guided every action and haunted every heart. Fear was everything, and the being that was the focus of that fear now stood above Ashimok, framed in the crimson light, bathing the stratagem. A god amongst warriors, a tyrant and a liberator. He was Abaddon the Despoiler, the son of Horus, the inheritor of the galaxy and lord of the ruinous host. His aquiline face was cruelly angled, with a hooded brow and sardonic lips, his porcelain pale skin striated with black veins. Armored in black and bronze, his ubiquitous topknot was unbound, framing his part-shaven skull in midnight black strands of hair. But it was his eyes that drew Ashimok's attention, eyes that had once beheld an age of legends, a time when gods had walked among their people, a time when the galaxy had burned as mankind's worth hung in the balance and had been found wanting. Abaddon had tasted bitter defeat, and the ashes of that fire still clung to his soul like widow's weeds. Where lesser warriors had broken or turned their hate inwards in bitter reproach, Abaddon had returned even stronger. Tempered by defeat and made wise by hardship, he had learned the lessons taught by loss and wrought them into a singular purpose that would eventually overturn the galaxy. "Get up," said Abaddon. Ashimok struggled to obey, feeling a gut-deep nausea that was utterly new to him. His post-human physique was immune to such things, but wrenched from the warp into real space was a sensation few survived. He reached down to push himself upright before realizing his arm was missing. The wound had long sealed, though he had no memory of any healing process. Just how long had he drifted in the warp, and what else might he not remember? He looked down at his chest, where the Phoenix Lord's blade had cloven his heart and lungs. No wound remained, only a jagged seam across his breastplate. Whatever power had returned him to the Despoiler had also undone the catastrophic damage to his body. He struggled upright, the last words he had heard on Velios ringing in his ears. "Archangels will burn the galaxy," he said. "What does that mean?" demanded Abaddon. "It was the last thing the Phoenix Lord said before she died, before Velios was destroyed." "A Phoenix Lord is dead," Ashimok nodded. "A warrior queen with a banshee wail." "Then your mission to the Karen system was not a total failure," grunted Abaddon. "But Eldar riddles are for another day." The Despoiler feigned indifference, but Ashimok saw the Phoenix Lord's words had lodged deep in Abaddon. His interest was piqued, and that realization, together with the whispering voices, made Ashimok bold. "It was not a failure, my lord," he said. "The Imperials will no longer be able to resupply their fleets at will." Ashimok lifted the stump of his arm and said, "It may have cost more than I intended, but it was no failure." Abaddon spun, and the talon he had torn from the corpse of his fallen father glittered in the blood-red light. The killing blades punctured Ashimok's breastplate and lifted him from the deck without effort. Abaddon's eyes bored into him. "Not a failure," said the Despoiler. "You were to bring me that world, sorcerer, not destroy it. With the resources you promised to seize, the Black Stones would already be in my possession. Or did you forget the oath you swore when I granted you leave to pursue your warp visions to Velios?" The voices whispered in his ear, cautioning restraint. "No, my lord, I did not forget," said Ashimok. "Arcona's time will come," said Abaddon, turning away and gesturing to a hololithic sector map of worlds on fire, system-wide void engagements, and an entire sector poised on the brink of defeat. "The Gothic War awaits," said Abaddon.